This might sound odd, but ancient Hebrew people were actually divided about how they felt about the Roman occupation. So, like, Rome conquered the people of Israel. That's the world Jesus lives in. It's the world of the New Testament. And it might be surprising to hear that different Jewish people felt differently about that. Because I would think, well, most Jewish people, like, my instinct is that most Jewish people would have a problem with it, right? For the obvious reasons, like not having freedom. We Americans are very big on freedom. We talk about freedom every 9 seconds. So, like, we understand, like, how important freedom is to us. If you just lose freedom completely, that's not good. Like, that's not a happy thing. And so there's that. There's the whole taxation thing, like, and they don't get representation, guys. This is not like a with representation kind of taxation. In fact, like, their taxation, it's not just, it's like the double whammy of not only did you lose your money, but you know that your money is going to, like, foreign wars and foreign occupations and conquering other lands that aren't good. Like, it makes sense why people would be against the Roman occupation. People generally don't like their land being occupied by a foreign army and a foreign nation. Which is why it's somewhat surprising that actually, I mean, there were some Jews that were fine with it. And it's hard for us to understand. It's hard for us to get to, but that's because we don't have the shared history with the people of Israel. You see, the people of Israel, they've gone through a lot. You know, there's a lot of you know, we in our world are very big on you know, maybe righting the wrongs of the past and, you know, putting, you know, forth marginalized people, and that's great. That's good. We should do that. But, like, ancient Jewish people sort of laugh at everyone else's marginalization and suffering. Like, they basically begin as slaves, and then between then and Jesus, for basically 1,500 years, are occupied by somebody. They're conquered, they're exiled, their land is destroyed, their temple is destroyed, their kings get killed, their prophets get killed. Like, not like it's not good. And even when they do get sort of a reprieve, like, there's just one time that's a very famous time when they get a reprieve where the people, the Hebrews, actually get to self-govern, get their own king, you know, a couple hundred years before Jesus. It doesn't go any better than it was when everybody else is doing it. So there were those in the first century who actually just looked at what was going on with Rome and said, you know, all things considered, while we may not love the fact that Rome is here, compared to, like, the Assyrians, or compared to, like, the Egyptians, or compared to, you know, the Babylonians, or compared to what things could be, like, compared to what we had when we had independence and it didn't work out very well, the Romans were fine. So, relatively speaking, this occupation to them, to this group of people, was actually better than other occupations. Relatively speaking, this pain and suffering was actually a measure better than the other pain and suffering they went through. And so there was this debate, there was this division amongst the ancient Hebrews where some people said, look, I don't, you know, this is all terrible. They're pointing out sort of the low-hanging fruit, the obvious stuff, that Rome is bad, and, you know, the Caesar claims he's God. It's this whole thing. We shouldn't be loyal to the Romans. And then there's other people who are saying, right, but history tells us it could be so much worse, which is sort of just count our blessings and give in and not worry about it. And so while some Jewish people fought and fought back, and it got really bloody and ugly, other Roman people actually kind of pledged, or other Hebrew people sort of just kind of pledged allegiance to Rome and moved on with their lives. This was, the point is, a big debate in the first century world, and it is a debate that Jesus never weighed in on. Like, he just bowed out of it. And we can think of all the reasons why he would have done that and why that was wise. But Jesus just was very, very apolitical. He was very much just hands off, stood back. You know, it wasn't so much that you would listen to his teaching and you would see what he did and you would get the impression that he just didn't care. That it just wasn't important to him at all. I mean, okay, yeah, there's that one time where, you know, he kind of takes a shot at Herod after Herod kills John the Baptist, after, you know, Herod kind of picks a fight with him. Finally, that's what it takes for Jesus to kind of get involved and make it known that he's not a big fan of the Herod family. But other than that, Jesus really just is hands off until the last week of his life. It's almost like the Pharisees at this point, it's like a Hail Mary. Like there's this weapon they've got. This, if they can get Jesus to take a side, obviously that's going to undercut his ministry because there's some people who are pro Rome, there's other people who are against Rome. If they can get Jesus to say something kind of incriminating, that's going to really hurt his ministry. But Jesus had never ever made any kind of move one way or the other. There was never any inkling this was going to work, and so it's the last week of his life. They're sort of desperate. The Pharisees at this point are sort of desperate to get Jesus to say something or do something because the people at this point love Jesus. We'll talk about that here soon. But the people at this point of his ministry, they all love him. The Pharisees have lost the game of public opinion, and they are now ready for the Hail Mary. Maybe Jesus will say something incriminating. Maybe he'll mess up. Maybe he'll say something stupid. So during the last week of Jesus' life, after 3 years of Jesus not talking about this at all, they say, fine, let's try to get Jesus in on this divisive thing. Let's try to see if he'll weigh in. And they go to Jesus and they say, all right, Jesus, here's our question. Do you believe that we should pay taxes to Caesar? That's a very specific question. That we should pay taxes to Caesar. Is it right for us to pay taxes to Caesar? Now, they're not asking Jesus to start a revolution. They're not asking Jesus to say, like, oh, no, like, let's stop, or, hey, let's go collect. Like, they're just saying, it's as vague as it can be. It's as generic as it can be. It's the kind of question that anyone who hears it can kind of put their own opinion into, right? It's one of those questions. It's kind of one of those loaded questions that, like, anybody can hear what they want to hear. And so it's, hey, should we be doing this? If he says no, well, then there's a whole crowd of people who are going to argue with him. If he says yes, there's a whole crowd of people who are going to argue with him. This is their shot. Jesus has been apolitical, but let's see what we can do. And this is his answer, which we read in the Gospel according to Mark. It says, Jesus saw through their hypocrisy. And he said, why are you trying to trap me? Show me a Roman coin, and I'll tell you. When they handed it to him, he asked, whose picture and title are stamped on it? Caesar's, they replied. Well then, Jesus said, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and give to God what belongs to God. His reply completely amazed them. Now, this is a great answer for a few reasons, okay? It's a great answer because Jesus, this is the best way to deflect the question and also show how silly it is. So Jesus says, look, I need somebody hand me a coin. And that is genius because it's of two things. Number one, Jesus doesn't have a coin. So he is making the point that this whole taxation thing is theoretical because I don't participate in your whole world of money and taxes anyway. I don't got anything to tax, so it doesn't matter. I solved that problem real quick. You can't take blood from a turnip. I'm the turnip. That's the blood. So he doesn't have a coin. So he says, look, I don't have a coin. So somebody else hand me a coin. So he says, somebody hand me a coin. And wouldn't you know what? A Pharisee reaches in his pocket and pulls out a coin, which sort of unveils the whole thing. The Pharisees are complicit in this whole system. They want to argue about taxes. Well, here's something. Why don't you argue about money? Like, why don't we talk about money in and of itself? You're mad about taxes. Maybe you should have created a system in which you didn't need money in the first place, so you couldn't be taxed either. How about that? Jesus completely just dismantles the whole conversation, shows how silly it is, says, look, Caesar's face is on it. If you're going to participate in his system, give him his taxes. I don't care. You're part of his system. You got to pay the piper. I'm not part of the system. I don't need to worry about it. I don't think that that's actually what amazed the Pharisees, though. Because it says at the end, the passage says that answer amazed the Pharisees. I don't think that actually amazed them. I think probably if you were to ask, like, if we could bring a Pharisee in here who asks a question and you say, hey, what do you think Jesus is going to do? And they're like, oh, probably some trick where he's out of it completely. Because that's what he does. That's Jesus. We've got 3 years of watching Jesus do this stuff. All right. So, like, they knew that Jesus was going to be slippery, and they also knew that Jesus was a homeless drifter. Like, they knew he didn't have any money in the first place. So, they probably could have guessed where this was going. Like I said, it was a Hail Mary. What's amazing, I think, though, is the second part of what Jesus says. Because Jesus doesn't just say, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. He actually says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's. And that's fascinating. Of course, what is God's, if you're a Pharisee or if you're a Hebrew at all, what belongs to God more than anything else is people. The foundational confession of a Hebrew religious person is a confession of love for God with all their hearts and souls and minds. That's the confession, that we love the Lord our God. He is our Lord with all our hearts and souls and minds. To a Jewish person, that is what belongs to God then. Our hearts, our souls, and our minds. That's what belongs to God, is us. We belong to God. We all belong to God. That's foundational, bottom floor, ground level theology for the entire Bible, for Christians, for Jews, for everybody. We all belong to God. And so as faithful people, we are responsible to give to God what is God's, our hearts and our souls and our minds. Here's why that's amazing. Pharisees know this. What's amazing is this is not a rebuke. I think they were probably bracing for Jesus to kind of yell at them. It's happened. It's going to happen again here soon. I think they were sort of bracing themselves for Jesus to embarrass them or say something that makes them look like idiots, which happens all the time. I mean, not in a mean way, but just, sometimes you got to knock people down a peg. In this case, though, Jesus doesn't knock anybody down a peg. Jesus is kind. He's generous. And he invites them to be better. It's as if Jesus, Mark says, Jesus sees through their hypocrisy, and it's as if Jesus is saying, look, guys, come on. Really? Like, that's Jesus' answer, and distilled into one sentence. Come on, guys, really? Like, you guys are better than this. You're the religious leaders of Israel. You interpret and teach the law, and this is how you spend your time? Trying to trap me with, nonsense I'm not going to be trapped in? Don't you guys have, anything better to do? Anything? Jesus actually gives them the benefit of the doubt that they do have something better to do. He tells them, give to God what's God's. This is not, this trying to trap me business, this arguing about Rome, this, political shenanigan game nonsense, that is not giving to God what is God's. That is not worshiping God with all of your heart and all of your soul and all of your mind. That is not that. And you know it, and I know it, and everybody knows it. And so Jesus simply invites the Pharisees to be better because they are better. It's kind. It's the same invitation he gives to his disciples. It's the same invitation he gives to anyone he preaches to. You guys are better than this. You know it and I know it, so let's do better together. And the Pharisees were amazed. And they don't listen. Because, listening would be hard, Listening would mean, the easy thing is try to trap Jesus, make him look bad, and then winning some game. That's the easy thing. The hard thing is actually doing what Jesus said, which is being better. Anytime someone says you should be better than that, there's a reason people aren't better, right? Because being better is harder than being not better. It's more difficult to do the right thing than it is to do the wrong thing. Trying to trap Jesus, that's so easy. Actually trapping Jesus, it never works. But sitting around talking about how could we get this guy? That's super easy. Offering God what is God's, loving him with your heart and your soul and your mind, that's really hard. So they didn't do it. And now that we've said that, now we can talk about the Apostle Paul. So the Apostle Paul, in our minds as Christians, particularly 2,000 years after the fact, is a very unique figure in Christian history. I mean, he's the guy who writes the Bible, most of it. He's the guy who writes, a huge chunk of the New Testament. That's unique because nobody else did that. He's a guy, if we dig a little bit deeper into why he was writing all the letters, why he was doing all that, he is the apostle to the Gentiles. Right, so the church was mainly Jewish, was entirely Jewish, and then it started to branch out, and then it was like 99% Jewish and 95% Jewish and 90% Jewish. And as it went from totally Jewish to like mainly Jewish, and then by the end of the first century, it flipped and it was almost all Gentile. The Apostle Paul is in the center of that. Like, he's the one who does ministry at the first community, the first church that has Gentiles in it. He's the one who's traveling around the world, planting all the churches that he ends up writing all the letters to that end up as Bible books, right? So Paul is, he's a unique figure. And what we have to understand, it's so important for us to understand, is this. Paul was not unique, like even a little bit. At least before he became a Christian, at least before he becomes this apostle to the Gentiles. That's the one thing that makes him unique. Outside of that, the Apostle Paul is just like all the other Pharisees. Paul was a Pharisee. That's what he was. He was exactly like those guys who tried to trap Jesus with his coin question. He was just like them. He was literally one of them. Had he been there that day, he actually, for all we know, did do it. We have no idea. But what we know is that Paul is a Pharisee just like them. He was educated as a Pharisee. He believed in and taught the law just like the Pharisees. He valued the law above and beyond anything else, just like all the other Pharisees. And even for what we seem to think that he's unique with, like what we, in our minds, we're like, okay, well, he persecuted the church. That's how he ends up, with the road to Damascus and the bright light and the blinding and the conversion. Like, that's because he was uniquely attacking the church. Even that wasn't unique. So the first time we see Paul persecuting anybody, the first martyr that we find is a guy named Stephen. And Paul is the guy who, if you read the text, basically takes, responsibility. Like, he's overseeing it. He's approving of everything, right? Which means he has authority to approve or disapprove and the whole thing. The reality is, he's not the one who physically killed Stephen. It was a bunch of other guys who killed Stephen, and Paul just approved of it. Paul was part of a system that persecuted the church. Part of a system that persecuted the church. So then we read that he went door to door and he was arresting people, right? But the fact of the matter is, he had to, once he arrested people, like he goes to somebody's house and he arrests them, he puts them in chains. Well, he's got to put them somewhere. Like, he can't, like, he doesn't have the prison at his house. He doesn't build the prison himself. Like, he takes the Christians to the prison, and there they face, prosecution and persecution. Hey, those words are real similar. Not in every case, but in this case, yeah, persecution, prosecution. They all face that with a criminal justice system. That Paul's arresting the people, right? Like, he's not, like, you wouldn't say like a cop is unique in a criminal justice system, because there's also judges and lawyers and prisons and wardens. And there's a whole system, right? Paul was just a cog in the machine. And even when he wants to make himself more than a cog, right? Even when he's like, okay, I actually feel like we need to be expanding this thing. It was his idea, that we can tell, to go to Damascus, where there was a lot of Christians there, and let's persecute the people of Damascus. Let's do all of that. Even through all of that, he had to go to the high priest to A, get permission, and B, get letters of authority so he could go do what he was going to do in Damascus. All of that is to say, like, Paul is not a good guy. Paul absolutely is persecuting people. Paul absolutely is hurting, he causing people to die and imprisoning people. Paul's a terrible, terrible guy, but he's just one of a bunch of terrible guys. It's not like Paul is unique. And if we can say that out loud, it's really important, because then it lets us say this out loud. That if Paul is a Pharisee and is not unique, then what Jesus offered to Paul is probably an awful lot like what Jesus offered to the guys who tried to trap him with the taxes to Caesar question. I mean, if this is how Jesus treats erring Pharisees in one context, and Paul is nothing but an erring Pharisee, then probably we should understand that all that really happened with Paul is Jesus, in kindness, in mercy, and in love, told Paul, you're better than this. You're better than this persecution. You're better than that, and more to the point, you should give to God what is God's. You should love the Lord your God with all of your heart and all of your soul and all of your mind. When we hear the story, we remember the story, and we read the story of Paul on the road to Damascus and the blinding light, and he falls down, the scales on his eyes, and Jesus says, why are you persecuting me? And he goes to Damascus, and he ends up, the scales come off, and he gets baptized, and all that stuff happens, right? And he becomes a Christian. All of that, all of it, can be summarized by Jesus going to a Pharisee and saying, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. Give to God what is God's. And of course, we know that what makes Paul unique, if we can go back to what does make him unique, is he says yes. I think, though, that sometimes we undersell how hard that was. Because we say, oh, okay, well, he saw Jesus. If you see the risen Jesus and you get blinded and, you're only going to be, as far as you know, not blind anymore if you convert, that's an easy decision. But in the book of Galatians, Paul actually talks about the decision that he made, particularly as it related to the law of Moses, which before he met Jesus was the center of his entire ethical life, of his entire spiritual life, and in fact, in his entire life altogether. And this is what we read him saying happened. What tangibly happened as he converted one to the other, as he gave to God what is God's, as he loved the Lord his God with all his heart, soul, and mind. This is what he says. He says, when I tried to keep the law, it condemned me. So I died to the law. I stopped trying to meet all of its requirements so that I might live for God. My old self has been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. So I live in this earthly body by trusting in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. This is one of those, really, I've joked for years about, those verses we, sew on pillows. The T-shirt verses. When I was a kid, we had, the Christian bookstores everywhere, and you would have, the terrible puns, right? Bloodwiser, his blood's for you. We had the terrible puns, but this is one of those verses. This is always this. I feel like we're so familiar with this verse, we don't feel the weight of it, of what Paul is saying. Paul was a Pharisee. His entire life revolved around the law, and he had to see it was killing him and other people, but it was killing him. All the law was doing was condemning him. He says that's all it was doing. All these rules and regulations, this way of looking at God, this way of looking at faith, this way of looking at people, it was just making life impossible. There's a lot of ways we can look at that word condemn, but let's just say this. It was making it impossible for him to love the Lord, his God, with all his heart, soul, and mind. The law made it impossible for him to do that. So he quit doing it. I mean, in one of the great undersells of the century, he just says, so I stopped doing it. One day, an adult man just up and said, I will stop doing all the things I've done my entire life, that I built my entire life on. Ethical, spiritual, political. The Pharisees supported Rome. This was a political conversation too, by the way. I've got to change my mind about everything. I've got to change my actions because of what my mind says now. He compares it to being crucified, which is two things. Number one, it's a death. He says it's like a death, but also, what is a crucifixion if not an extraordinarily painful death? He's saying this was so hard. It hurt to do this. It was the most difficult thing I've ever done. It was, I mean, I didn't just die, I died in agony because that simply had to go. And now, I mean, we say, well, it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me, and we think that's a good thing. Think about what he's saying. He's saying, I am now an empty shell. I am a broken shell of a man now. Everything I studied, everything I learned, everything I did, everything I was is gone. I am a shell of a man, and all that can happen now is that Christ lives in me. Because if Christ's not going to live in me, nothing's living in me because I'm gone. I'm dead. This is dramatic language, but when we think about the cost, you see, when we read this passage, I now fully understand why the Pharisees, when they tried to trap Jesus, and Jesus says, give back to God what's God's, and they understand all that. I understand why they said no. Because saying yes was so much more difficult. It cost literally everything. And now that I've said that, we can talk about Ananias. So Ananias was this Christian who lived in Damascus. He was a leader in the church. He was respected. Everybody liked him. He was one of those guys that just oozed, charisma. Just everybody liked this guy. And he was in Damascus, and Damascus was kind of this safe haven where a lot of Jewish Christians had escaped from Jerusalem. They'd gone to Damascus to try to just get out of harm's way. And they set up the church there, and Ananias was one of the leaders of the church there. And the whole Paul situation happens. And this is what we read happens to Ananias. This is where he is in the conversation. Paul is blind. He's taken to Damascus, and we read this. It says, the Lord said, go over to Straight Street to the house of Judas, not Iscariot. When you get there, ask for a man from Tarsus named Saul. Yeah, like we know more than one guy from Tarsus. He is praying to me right now. I have shown him a vision of a man named Ananias coming in and laying hands on him so he can see again. But Lord, exclaimed Ananias, I've heard many people talk about the terrible things this man has done to the believers in Jerusalem. And he is authorized by the leading priest to arrest everyone who calls upon your name. When I was younger, I always thought it'd be cool if Jesus just audibly talked to me. And then one day I read this story and I'm like, nope, I don't want Jesus to talk to me audibly. Because I always assume I'm going to like what I'm going to hear. But here's Ananias, who Jesus is just openly, they're just having conversations with. He's just like, hey, you see that football game? Yeah, it's amazing. We're watching this game with a pigskin. It's highly offensive to us Jews in the first century. But man, did you see? You see? We got a new quarterback. Traded Tyreek. Man. They're just talking, just having a good time. And then he's like, oh, by the way, here's what I need you to do. I love the way he words it. I need you to go over to this house. There's this guy named Saul of Tarsus. And you need to go pray for him and lay your hands on him so he's not blind anymore. As if Ananias doesn't know exactly who that is. I know exactly. You don't have to tell me who Saul of Tarsus is, man. I know who Saul of Tarsus is, which is why you're being coy about it, which is why I don't want to go. I don't want to go and do this. I don't want to do this at all. Let's talk more about football. I think it was a great trade. We got 5 draft picks. It's fine. And Jesus is like, no. We're on the Saul of Tarsus thing now. I need you to go do I'm telling you, my prayer, I pray and I think the Lord is leading, but I can be wrong and there's very little danger of me having to go do anything like this. I don't need direct revelation from Jesus. Ananias, I love, is this respected guy. I'm not making fun of him. I'm not anything. He's a respected guy. He's a good guy. He's a leader of the church. He's been through a lot, like he went from Jerusalem to Damascus, so as far as we can tell, and he's been through a lot. He's been persecuted. He's in danger every day, and Jesus says, "Hey, go welcome this guy, this Saul of Tarsus guy." And Ananias is like, "You got to be kidding me! That guy can kill me. I can literally die because of this guy, and not quickly, like slowly. This can be a slow, painful, agonizing death, or I can stay in this house and not do that." If I stay in this house, no slow, painful, agonizing death. If I go over there, there's a very good chance that's what happens. Remember, we think about Paul on the back end of doing all the nice stuff. That Paul doesn't exist yet. The only Paul they know is the Pharisee who's killed Christians. That's all they know. Here was the question for Ananias. And I like bringing Ananias up at this point because, man, it's fish in a barrel talking about the Pharisees. I mean, ain't nothing easier as a preacher than talking about the Pharisees being bad. I mean, and even Paul, like Paul is, you guys, everybody knows the story of Paul, so it's fine. It's easy. But here's Ananias. Here's a Christian, a guy just like you, a guy just like me, who was asked to love the Lord his God with all his heart and all his soul and all his mind, to give back to God what is God's. And he's asked to do it in a way that every person in this room would argue with. Because you don't know the end of the story. You have no idea who Paul's going to be. All you know is this guy can kill you legally. I don't know if we've thought about that before. Nobody in this room, as far as I can tell, has ever lived in a place like this is your home, and it is legal for someone to knock on your door and kill you. Legally speaking, it can happen. I don't know what that's like. But I do know I don't go knock on that guy's door and invite it. And Jesus directly says that's what you need to do. Man, that's a hard decision. That's absolutely as hard as giving up the law and saying I've been crucified with Christ and I'm a shell of a man now. Like that absolutely is more difficult, or as difficult. And I wish the Bible would give us an out and be like, well, Ananias, like he and Jesus came to an agreement where I'll do like half of it, but not like I'll do it in a safe way. I'll arm myself. I'll get so Ananias goes and gets 2 swords. And he goes to Paul and he's like, "Hey man, like we're gonna welcome you in here, but like not before a trial period where we got armed guards on you all the time." Like I wish there was like in my head I would have been like, "Hey Jesus, so what if we get some armed guards and then we baptize Paul?" Just to make sure. Because what if the baptism doesn't take, We've seen that before, like in the Bible, like baptisms don't take. Like guy gets baptized and he's not any different. Like we've seen that. Like it's not good. This is what we read. This is written from Paul's memory. This is how Paul remembers the story. In Acts chapter 22, we read this. Ananias came and stood beside me and said, "Brother Saul, regain your sight." And that very moment, I could see him. This is one of my favorite verses in the whole Bible. I wish that we put this on a T-shirt, though. It only makes sense with the backstory. So that'd be a really big T-shirt. Or very small lettering. He called him brother. Here's what we got to understand. To call someone your brother, in their context, in their world, first century Jewish world, first century Christian world, to call somebody your brother meant you are my brother in Christ. Paul addresses his letters to his brothers in Christ. Jesus called his disciples his brothers. That's how lofty of a title this is. Jesus called the disciples brothers. You call someone your brother because you are saying, I belong to God, you belong to God, and we are working towards living that out together as family. There is no kinder, no more inclusive term than you can give a fellow Christian than brother. And Ananias calls Paul a brother before Paul's a Christian. For all Ananias knows, Paul's going to regain his sight, immediately arrest Ananias, take him to jail, and there he will die. For all he knows. For all he knows, Paul does not convert. There is no baptism. There is no ministry. There is no apostleship, for all he knows. Ananias does not know the future. All he knows is that he is a man who is called to love the Lord his God with all his heart, soul, and mind. And that is sometimes very, very difficult. And when we deal with other people, whether they look like us, act like us, are our enemies or not, we're called to treat them like brothers. Ananias didn't like this. Remember, he argues with Jesus about it. But you know, one of the great things about faith is not a feeling. It's not. Faith is putting into action what we believe or suspect or want to believe or suspect. To be faithful is to do the right thing, whether you feel it or not. Ananias did not feel this thing he was doing. We know it. He argued with Jesus. But he did it because his faith told him, you do unto others as you would have them do to you. His faith said we give to God what is God's, and that is our whole hearts, our whole souls, and our whole minds. And Ananias wasn't sure about it, but he did it anyway. You see, these stories are all connected. It doesn't seem obvious at first, but they're all connected. These stories are all connected as we look at the Pharisees trying to trap Jesus and Jesus responding with, give to God what is God's. And understanding what that means to them, which is the foundation of our faith, which is we give to God our hearts and souls and minds. And they said, no, I don't want to do it because it's hard. Paul, a Pharisee, just like them, does exactly what Jesus said, but it's hard. By his own description, it's like an agonizing death that leaves him a shell of a man. It's hard. And he is able to become a Christian because someone else, Ananias, did something very hard. Giving to God what is God's. This morning, we're in our second week of our series called The Need for New Life. Here's why we need new life. Here's why we need resurrection. Here's why we need Easter. Because the world we live in goes like this. The hard thing and the easy thing are not aligned with the good thing and the bad thing. In a perfect world, doing the hard thing or doing the wrong thing should be hard. Right? Like you as parents, like that's the way, hopefully, as parents, that's how you're ordering your house. It's more difficult for your children to disobey you than it is to obey you. Like that's, because you want them to learn to do the right thing, right? That's how parenting works. That's how, that's how marriage should be working. Like there should be like incentives for, for good behavior. And like, it should be like, I want to be in this marriage because it's good, not I'm here because something bad might happen. Like that's the whole, like that's a whole other conversation. But like when we look at in a good world, in a perfect world, doing the right thing should be easy. But in the world we live in, doing the right thing is so hard. And doing the wrong thing is so easy. And the Pharisees prove it, and Paul proves it, and Ananias proves it, and we're just like them. We are called to give to God what is God's. We are called to love the Lord our God with all our hearts and souls and minds. And that is very difficult. And so we need new life. We need to be people who recognize this, who understand this perspective, and who go to Christ understanding that we miss out on so many things when we live for what is easy and wrong versus what is difficult and right. Pharisees missed out on the whole kingdom. They missed out on the church. They missed out on the gospel. They missed out on salvation. They missed out on all that stuff. Jesus said, you're better than this. And they said, no. Think about what Paul and Ananias would have missed out on if they had said, no. And for you and I, we need to learn from these three interwoven, connected stories and learn this lesson, our second lesson from our need for new life. And it is this: it is easier to not give to God what already belongs to him. But when we don't, we miss out on so much. It is easier to not give to God what already belongs to him, meaning us. But when we don't, we miss out on so much. The musicians are going to come forward. We're going to sing a song. We offer an invitation each and every week to take God up on this offer. The Bible teaches that, and we do that. We call it to repent and be baptized. That sounds like two things. It's really just one. In repentance, we change our minds. We change our hearts and souls and minds and our lives. We say, I want to do things God's way. In baptism, it's a physical picture of us aligning ourselves with Christ's death and resurrection, with that new life, with this new understanding. If you've never made the decision, Nice Warm Baptistry, we can do it anytime. Let's talk. If you're already an immersed believer in Christ, you're looking for a perfect church home, this place is not it. But we do serve a perfect God. We want to connect. We want to call. We want to cultivate. We want to meet new people. We want to share the gospel. We want to grow up while we do it. And we want to be people defined by doing the right thing, even when it's difficult, and turning our backs on the wrong thing, even when it's easy. As we stand,